G'day everyone, my name is Hoy, and in this video I'm kicking off my series on layer blend modes in Photoshop. This series will be an in-depth look into how layer blend modes work behind the scenes. I'll go through the calculations behind each blend mode, and for the most popular ones I'll also provide use cases so you can see how you can incorporate these into your workflow. Now Photoshop has 28 layer blend modes which are listed here, and in this first video I'll go through roughly the first quarter of these, which include Passthrough and the normal blend mode, which has 2 blend modes here, and then the Darken blend modes, which has 5 blend modes. I'll go through the other categories, which are lighten, contrast, inversion and component layer blend modes in follow-up videos. So at the end of this tutorial, I'm pretty sure that the vast majority of you will understand a lot more about blend modes, even if you've been using Photoshop for years. And that's because I'm not just going to regurgitate existing information from other tutorials. And that's the point of my channel. It's not just to show you how to click buttons in Photoshop, but also explain how things work behind the scenes. Now, I try to look for this type of information online to verify my understanding of layer blend modes, but whether it's free or paid, I just couldn't find it. So if you learned something new in this tutorial, please let me know in the comments what the new stuff you learned was, and please like and subscribe. So for the 3 of you who I haven't scared off already and have stuck around, let me start from the beginning, which is, what are blend modes? Now there are 2 types of blend modes, just to be sure. One are layer blend modes and the other ones are brush blend modes. And in this tutorial we'll go over the layer blend modes. The layer blend modes are what you see in the layers panel here. And the layers panel, if you can't see it, you can go up to window and then just make sure that layers is selected. And these are the blend modes that we're talking about, which you can access it through here. Now for the brush blend modes, if I activate my brush tool, B for my brush tool, you can see that the blend mode options are here, starting from normal and all the way down to luminosity. It looks very much like the layer blend modes, but it has 2 extra options, which are behind and clear. So if I go to the layer blend modes, it does not have behind and clear. So whenever I talk about blend modes, if I forget to say layer blend modes, I'm always talking about the layer blend modes, not the brush blend modes. I will go over what the brush blend modes behind and clear are, but that's for another tutorial. Okay, so with that caveat at the way, what are blend modes? So here I've got an image of just a normal photo. I've just skewed it just to look like a layer here. In the layer stack, when we're talking about blend modes, it's called the base layer. Now I put in brackets here what I refer to as the background layer, is basically the image that you have as the background. There's nothing new here, so we start off with the background layer, then we have to apply a blend layer, and this is the effect that we want to put on it. I'm just going to turn on the visibility of the blend layer, and here for the blend layer I've just created a colorful gradient. Now it doesn't need to be a colorful gradient to apply a blend, it could be anything. I'm just using it just to illustrate that point. With blend modes, here it's saying, okay, well, how do you want this layer, the blend layer, to interact with your base layer, your original layer? Now there are 28 types of options which I showed in the intro. Depending on which option that you choose, you will get the result layer. So I'm just going to turn that on, and here is the result for a particular blend mode called multiply. Now all blend modes won't look like this. It only applies to the multiply blend mode. Now the caveat also here is that you don't have a physical results layer, so you don't get 3 layers. You only get the blend layer and the base layer. I've broken the result layer out here just for illustrative purposes, so you can see the end result, but in reality you don't see another layer being generated called the result layer. Now just to cement that concept in a little bit more, I'm going to open my smart object in the results layer, and I'm just going to turn this off. So this is basically replicating what I had in my explainer file here. So I've got the base or background layer here, I've applied the gradient layer here, and then I've chosen a multiply blend mode. Now, as you can see, it doesn't create a third layer called the results layer. The results layer is basically what you see on the canvas here. Now, the result here will also be different depending on which blend mode that you choose. So now the question is, well, why do we want to use blend modes? Well, I think I've answered that partially already. You can see that here, depending on which option that you've chosen, it will give different effects. Now, the effects here probably doesn't look all that great. That's because I haven't chosen a particularly good blend layer. I've just applied a colorful gradient there. But blend modes are really powerful to create different types of effects on your images. And I'll walk you through some of the use cases as we go along. Now let's return back to our explanation file, and you see here is blank, so I'm just going to turn on the right side. And the final thing that we'll go through on this explainer file is just to highlight there are 8 special blend modes that are highlighted in yellow. Now I'll explain how it's special when we get to each of these blend modes. For the time being, let's get on to the first blend mode. I'm going to go to my second file here, and here, before I go on, I'm just going to walk you through the process of my explanation. I've got a couple of images here. One is a hot air balloon, and the other one, which you've already seen, which is the image of the woman and the red umbrella. I've got several different folders here which will help me highlight some of the blend modes and what they do and how they do it. I've also got this Excel file which will demonstrate the maths behind it. Now, you don't need to know the maths behind it to use blend modes, obviously. So this is obviously for geeks like me who likes this type of stuff and who wants to understand what the blend modes is doing behind the scenes. Of course, you can always just cycle through the blend modes just simply by going through it and scrolling down on these options. And while we're here, I'll also show you the keyboard shortcut to cycle through these. So if you activate your move tool by clicking V on the keyboard and then press Shift and plus, that will cycle through the blend modes from top to bottom. If you want to go from bottom to top, it's very similar. So you press Shift and then minus, and that will cycle up. So of course you can always experiment by trial and error, but I want to give you a more of a technical explanation of how these blend modes work. So the first blend mode that we'll walk through is Passthrough, but you'll see that if I click on this option here, that Passthrough is nowhere to be seen. It's normally on top of normal, and the reason why it's not showing is because that I've got a layer selected. Passthrough blend mode relates to group, so I need to be clicking on a group. So now you can see that Passthrough is there. If I click on this, you see that it's on top of normal. So I'm just going to click on this layer here, make it normal so we don't see the layer behind that. I'm just going to resize this, Command or Control T, and then just resize this a little bit smaller so we can see both images at the same time. I'm just going to make an effect on this layer by going up to curves and then just resize this so I can see the curves a little bit. And it really doesn't matter what effect that I'm going for. I just want to demonstrate that the curves that I'm using is affecting both layers here, right? So if I group this here, selecting the top one and then Shift and then selecting the bottom one and then press Command or Control G, it's still affecting both images here. Now you might say, well, Hoy, why don't you just clip this curve if you want it to only apply to this hot air balloon? So let's do that. And it's got the effect that we wanted. It's only applying to this layer here. But what if I continuously want to add some adjustments? Here I want to put, say, brightness and contrast. I want to up the brightness, right? And then I'm going to maybe increase the saturation here. So here it's increasing the brightness and saturation on all the layers beneath it, including this women with red umbrella layer. not this one here because it's clipped. Again, we can clip all these effects here, and then it will just contain all these effects to this hot air balloon image. Now, that's one way of doing it, and you can see that if you've got many adjustment layers, you've got to keep on clipping that to your background image here. A better way, perhaps a neater way of doing that, is simply setting this to normal. And by this, I mean the folder to normal. And then you can get rid of the clipping mask. And what that does is contains all these effects to this folder here. So the blend mode of this folder is normal, and all these adjustment layers are not clipped to this layer, but it hasn't affected this women layer here. So what Passthrough does is basically allows all kinds of effects, whatever effects that you apply to your layers and your images, to pass through right through any of the folders that you have your image contained in, and all the way down to the layers below that. Okay, so let's get on to our next blend mode, which is normal. Before we do that, I'm going to revert my file back to when I had it open. I can do that by pressing F12. Okay, so the next blend mode is normal. So let me just open that again. And with normal, it is simply like you've got two pieces of paper on top of each other. So I've got two images here, and the visibility of both images are turned on, yet you only see the hot air balloon, and that's just analogous of, a sheet of paper sitting on top of another. It doesn't blend at all with the other layer. The most blending that you can do with the normal layer is simply reduce the opacity or fill, and if I do that, you can start to see the layer underneath that. Reducing or increasing the opacity is exactly the same as increasing or decreasing the fill. It doesn't make a difference on the normal blend mode. Now, there are 8 special blend modes where opacity and fill has different effects, but not for normal. So normal, they're exactly the same. So the next blend mode that we'll talk about is dissolve. It looks immediately like the normal blend mode. You start to wonder, well, what's the point of dissolve? It's true that it's like the normal blend mode when your opacity or fill is at 100%. But when I start to decrease that or increase that, you can see straight away that it is different to the normal blend mode. And let me just zoom in here, Option or Alt on my keyboard, and scroll wheel mouse up. And what it's doing is that by sliding this down and reducing the opacity, it is turning off or leaving the pixels on, and that's why you can see the background layer. Now, there is no transparency to the dissolve layer. It's simply turning the pixels on or off. So you can see that the pixels are either on or off. There's no transparency to it. What Photoshop is doing is assigning each pixel with a value from 1 to 99, and then when you adjust the opacity slider, it's turning these random values off or leaving them on. Now I'm just going to fit it to screen again, Command and Control 0. And let's just talk about the use cases. I've got a use case folder here. I'm just going to turn that back on. And here I've just created a dab of the brush here, a very soft brush with the color magenta. You can see that the opacity is at 100, the fill is at 100, and so it looks just like normal. Now, if I select the dissolve blend mode, you can see this dithering pattern now. So one of the first questions that you might ask is, well, how did that happen? Didn't you just say when the opacity is at 100 and the fill is 100, it doesn't do this pattern, this dithering pattern, which is true. But because I used a feathered brush, as in a soft edge brush, those soft edges has transparency in it, and that's why it has these dithering patterns at 100% opacity and 100% fill. Now, in all my time using Photoshop, I've not used dissolve blend mode before because I can create similar types of effects using other techniques. But if you want to use the dissolve blend mode, you can create cool looking patterns. So if I just create another layer on top of this, B for my brush tool, just going to increase the brush size here and then just soften the brush edge here. Just going to choose a color and let's pick I don't know, something like this, and then just paint over it and change the blend mode to dissolve, I can start to reduce the opacity, and you can see that you can start to make abstract patterns here. Now you can apply it to an image, a painting, a brushstroke, etc. So I'll let your imagination run wild with this. Now the next blend mode we'll walk through is part of the Darken blend mode. So let's go to our blend mode here, and this is what we'll go through, Darken. So what is the Darken blend mode doing? Well, let me pull up my Excel spreadsheet. There really isn't a calculation as such. Now the formula for this is basically it's taking the minimum value of the base layer or the blend layer. So whatever value is lower, it will take that. I think most of you would know that in an RGB image, the colors are made out of 3 different colors, right? The red, green, and blue. And in the red, green, blue color mode, it has a tonal range between 0 to 255. 0 being black and 255 being white. So the spreadsheet that you see in front of you, and I bet you weren't expecting to see a spreadsheet in a Photoshop tutorial, but you'll see why I'm using this a little bit later. The random color that I've chosen is got a value of a red value of 55, 180 for green, and then 98, which gives us this color here, this greenish color. Now I've done the same thing for the blend layer, which is the top layer, and then this is the resulting layer. Now let's go through it column by column, line by line. Now these are just the random values I've chosen here. It could be any color that you want. Now just to demonstrate, I could put 167 here and the color here will change. So I'm just going to reset that to what I had it before, and let's explain what the normalized values are. Now the normalized value is simply the percentage out of 255. So 55 divided by 255 equals 0.22 and so on. The question then is, well, why do we need to divide it by 255? And the reason for that is because there are different bit depth. So an 8-bit RGB image has a tonal range of 256. That's 2 to the power of 8. Now the tonal range of a 16-bit RGB image is not 256. It's actually 2 to the power of 16, which is over 65,000. So what does that mean? It means that a value of 55 in an 8-bit image is not the same tonal value as if you were using a 16-bit image or a 32-bit image. So in other words, if I were to pick white in an 8-bit image, the tonal value would be 255. But if I chose 255 for a 16-bit image, 255 isn't white on a 16-bit image. So that's why you have to normalize the value. And you do that by basically expressing the value as a percentage. So the range of the normalized value here is between 0, which is black, and 1, which is white. So if you're talking about 1 for the tonal value of a 16-bit image, then we're both talking about white, whether we're talking about it for an 8-bit image here or a 16-bit image down below. So going back to the Darken formula, what it's doing is comparing channel by channel which one is darker. In Photoshop terms, it means which one has got a lower value, because a lower value is closer to 0 and 0 is black. So what Darken does is compares, okay, the red channel for the base layer is 0.22, compare it with the blend layer of 0.26. Now which one's lower? It is this one. So the value, the result value would be 0.22. Then it does the same calculation for the green channel, compares 0.71, compare it with 0.18 on the blend layer, and because the 0.18 is lower, it will use the 0.8 value. And similarly for the blue, 0.38 compared to 0.48, this one's lower, so we'll use this. So the resulting color would be this color, which translates into this value, RGB value here. That's the maths behind it. We can verify that by going back to Photoshop, and I've got these example bars here, which is exactly what you saw in my Excel spreadsheet. So this here, I just want to show you that it actually overlaps. So if I select this bit, it goes around about here, and then the green one overlaps the purple one. So the in between here, the intersect, should be the resulting color. So if I go to darken blend mode, just going to deselect this and then check out what color this is. I'm going to press I on the keyboard to invoke my eyedropper tool. Click once here, just click here again. So the RGB value here I've got from Photoshop is 55, 46, 98. So if I verify that, 55, 46, 98, resulting in this even darker color. So as a use case, how would we use that? Whoops, it's not in this file here, it's actually here. So I actually use the darken blend mode to create this yellow bits here. So what I've done here is to highlight this special 8 blend modes. I've just simply created a yellow box here and then just filled it with the color. In this case it was yellow. I'm doing this very quickly, so let's make a layer here so the pixels have somewhere to go. Let's press Option or Alt and then delete on our keyboard. Going to deselect that, and because it's on normal blend mode, we can't see beneath it. Because the words are darker than my yellow here, what I can do is select the darken blend mode, and the darker pixels will come out because it's literally selecting to show the darker pixels on top. Now all the blend modes in the darken group, including this darken blend mode, has a neutral color, and that neutral color is white. So what that means is that it will make white transparent. When you use darken, it will slightly change the color. So just be a little bit careful about when you want to use it. So if you want color accuracy, don't use the darken blend mode because it will shift your colors. So some of the other uses is when you want to use it for burning or shading areas that you want, and as well as you don't mind changing the colors. So let's go on to the next blend mode, which is multiply. Now, as you can see, because multiply is part of the darken blend mode, it will darken stuff. But how does it darken stuff? So let's go back to our trusty little Excel spreadsheet. Now the formula here is relatively simple, which is whatever value that you've got on your base layer, you multiply that with the blend layer. And that's where the name multiply comes from, if you ever wondered. So using my same colors here, literally it's doing channel by channel the following calculation. So the red channel on the base layer, which is the bottom layer or your background layer, multiplied by the red layer on your blend layer. So this times this equals this, which gives us a tonal value of 14, and then it does the same calculation for the green channel. 0.71 times 0.18, which equals 0.13, and then similarly 0.38 times 0.48 equals this. Now the reason it darkens is that when you multiply a decimal or a fraction, it always will become a smaller number. And remember, the smaller value that you have, the closer you are to 0. And closer you are to 0, you are closer to black. And that's why multiply will always darken things. Now let's verify our calculation in Photoshop. So let's go to our example bars here and just turn this off. Change this to multiply, and we're going to sample this intersection here. Just click on that, and then we have a value of 14, 32, 47. So let's go back to our Excel spreadsheet, 14, 32, 47. Now let's go through the use cases of this. So here I've got an image of a best shelter which I used in one of my tutorials, which you can also follow. Just click on the link in the card up top, or you can go to the description below. What I wanted to do was put this image of this lady here so it looks realistic. At the moment, it doesn't look realistic if I put normal. So if I just concentrate on this edge here, this is normal blend mode and this is multiply. Can you see the difference that it makes? that it brings back the shadows. Now, the other example, if I just fit it to screen again, now like the other example, I used this photo as part of my other tutorial on double exposure. Again, you can find the card on top or the link down in the description below. And one of the things that I wanted to do in that tutorial was add these cool looking birds here. Now, this is a stock image that had white as the background and these black birds here. And I didn't want to spend hours masking this. And luckily I didn't have to, because all I did was use the multiply blend mode. So if I go here and select multiply, it automatically deletes or makes invisible the white areas. All the blend modes in the darken group will make white transparent. So if I zoom in here, you can see that I've saved myself hours and hours of masking this, and it simply just kept the dark areas and discarded the white areas. Now, the final concept that I want to raise with multiply is the concept of commutative blend modes, which means that it doesn't matter which order your layers are in, it will still have the same outcome. So here I've got two groups, one with the hot air balloon here, and that's set on multiply. The other is the woman with the red umbrella, and that is set on normal. So if I turn on the visibility of this layer, which is basically the same, but the order switch, so I've got the woman with the red umbrella on top with the multiply blend mode, and then the hot air balloon with the normal blend mode, they're all the same. So I'm going to turn off this layer here, this group here, and just watch for the difference if you can see it. So let's turn this off, on, off, on. So there is no difference whether you put the hot air balloon on top and make that as the blend mode, or the woman on top and make that as the multiply blend mode. It doesn't matter. So let's get on to the next blend mode, which is color burn. So what you can see here is that the result is darker than multiply because it gives more intense colors in the midtones, but reducing the detail in the highlights. Let's walk through mathematically what it's doing here. Now, this formula is a little more complicated. So what it's doing is that it's taking the inverse of the base layer. So what the inverse means is just 1 minus whatever the value here, which is 0.78, and then dividing it by the value in the blend mode, and then inversing that result, which is where you have -1 here. Now, this minimum 1 here just simply means that if it goes beyond 1, it will just cap it at 1. Essentially what it's doing, it darkens the midtones and makes the highlights brighter. This is an important concept because it is part of the special 8 blend mode, and I'll show you how these concepts connect a little bit later. For the time being, let's explain a little bit deeper how color burn works. So this here, I've got one gradient here vertically, and then a 50% grade layer here. I'm just going to demonstrate that by putting it onto normal. So this is a normal black and white gradient, and then this is the 50% gray layer here. If I turn on the color burn layer, you can see that where we intersect, the midtones are much more intense compared to, say, the multiply or the darken blend mode. So why did I want to show you this then? Because of the special 8 blend modes. The significance of the special 8 blend modes means that when I dial or adjust the opacity slider, it's going to have a different effect than if I were to adjust the fill slider. Now the opacity slider is here and the fill slider is here. So let me just close this for 1 second and then just go back to our image here, and let's see what I mean. So if I reduce the opacity, you can see that the whole image is kind of fading here, right? So if I bump that all the way back up to 100% and then do the same thing with fill, it has a slightly different effect. So then the question is, well, what is the effect that it's doing? Which is why I showed you the gradient here. So with the gradient, we can see a little bit better what it's doing. So let's just go to our color burn layer here. So opacity simply just fades the whole layer, right, evenly. But if I bump that up all the way to 100 and then do the same thing with fill, you can see that it's fading the areas that are not intersecting with the black and white gradient here, But just take a look at this intersection here, that somehow it's kind of lessening the effect without fading it uniformly, right? So what is that doing? Well, it's equivalent to reducing the midtones and highlights, because remember, the effect that color burn has is that it darkens the shadows. If I reduce the fill, it kind of goes back or reverts back to as if it didn't have any of those darkening effects here. Now I can show you another way of proving that. I've created a levels adjustment layer here. I'm just going to double click on this, and if I reduce the midtones here all the way back here, and then as well as reducing the white point beyond the gray point, because my original horizontal bar here is 50% gray, then the effect after I slide this past 128 here, it doesn't have any effect here. But just for good measure, I'm just going to slide that all the way back here. And you see that by adjusting the midtones and the highlights so that it's all the way to the left here, it's exactly the same as reducing the fill. So let me prove that to you. I'm going to take a snapshot of this. So I'm going to go to my history and take a snapshot, go all the way up here. Now you see that I've done a number of snapshots here, but this is the one that I want. So this is the levels adjustment, and I'm going to just restore all these settings back and then reduce the fill to 0. Take another snapshot, and now let's compare the two. Now this image here is when fill is at 0, and this image here is when we've adjusted the levels. Now the difference is where it doesn't intersect. We'll ignore that for the time being. All we're worried about is the intersection here. Now you can see that there are no difference in the intersection here. So now you know that effectively what the special 8 blend modes is doing is basically reducing the midtones and the highlights to a point where it's faded all the way out if you put it to the extreme setting, instead of the opacity, which fades out the image on a uniform basis. Now let's go through a use case. So I'm just going to collapse this. I'm just going to turn on the visibility of this, and I'm just going to deal with the hot air balloon. What I want to show you as a use case is that you can use color burn to color grade your image. Actually, I'm going to use this image here instead. So I'm going to create a solid color, and I'm just going to pick a bluish color because what I want to do is just put some coolness in the image. So let's change that to color burn, and obviously this is too dark, so let's reduce that to somewhere like 25, and this is before and this is after. And if that's too much, obviously you can always dial down the fill, but you can also reduce the amount in the shadows or the highlights by using the blend if sliders. So what I want to do is just to take out a little bit from the shadows and just move that out of the way. So you can see the door here, that this is the before, after. So something like this. You can color grade it. If you don't like the color, you can always choose another color, you know, magenta-ish, etc. So that's one of the uses of color burn. And before we move on to the next blend mode, what I want to highlight here is that color burn is a non-commutative blend mode, which means that you can't swap the layers around. So let me just delete this and go back to our use case here. I've created the similar effect where we have the hot air balloon on top, and the blend mode is color burn. The bottom or the base layer is normal, and then I've just switched the order. The color burn is on top for the women with the red umbrella, and then the hot air balloon is normal. So if I turn off this group here, you can see that there's a vastly different effect. So you cannot swap the layer order and expect the same color burn effect. This is what we call non-commutative blend modes. Okay, so let's get on to our next blend mode, which is linear burn. I'm going to switch on this layer and just change it to linear burn. Now, as you see, that the linear burn is even darker than multiply and color burn, but it's not as saturated as color burn. So it darkens the whole image, including whites. So let's walk through the calculations by going back to our Excel file. And the formula here is rather simple. So it's the base plus blend minus 1. So this plus this minus 1. If you do that, you'll get a negative value. You can't go beyond 0. So it's capped at 0, which is why you have black here. Let's just confirm our understanding by going to our example bars here with the linear burn. I can go back to my layer here, select linear burn, and then just make sure that this is black here. So RGB value of 0, 0, 0. Now I mentioned that linear burn is basically the same as color burn. The only big difference is that the whites are not protected. So let me just demonstrate that. Make this gradient linear burn and just turn this on as normal now. So what I'm going to do is create a new layer on top of this and get my B for my brush tool and then select white as my foreground color. And I'm just going to paint it like this. And you can see that it's kind of not white here, right? Because the blend mode, the linear burn blend mode, is having an effect on my white layer here. So if I change the blend mode from linear burn to color burn, you can see that the white here is, whoops, I've brushed it on the gradient itself. You can see here that the white is maintained here. So again, if I change it to linear burn, it's not protecting the white. Why does it matter? It just means that the linear burn blend mode is darker than multiply and color burn, but not as saturated as the color burn blend mode. It is less colorful and it could be used in a similar way that you would use the color burn, which is darken shadows, deepen colors, or deeper burning, as in dodging and burning. Okay, so let's get on to the last blend mode in the darken blend mode group, which is called darker color. Now the darker blend mode is a lot like the darken blend mode, which was the first one out of the darker blend mode group that we walked through, but it's just a harsher version. So let's just go through exactly what it does. Now our trusty Excel spreadsheet is here. It's got a little bit more explanation to this. I'm just going to collapse this so it doesn't confuse anyone. Recall that the Darken blend mode is also taking the lower of the base value or the blend value. The difference is that the Darken blend mode, I'll just skip back to here, is that it does it on a per channel basis. It goes through the red channel and compares the base layer with the blend layer and compares it channel by channel, green with this green, blue with this blue, and then whatever's lower, it will go to the resulting layer. Now remember, there is no physical third resulting layer. I'm just using that as an illustrative example. Now let's go back to our darker color example. So what is the difference? The difference is that it uses the composite, the luminosity of all these channels, and then replaces the pixel with the one that's darker. So it doesn't go channel by channel. It uses the whole luminosity of each pixel and then chooses the darker one. Now the math behind this isn't that complicated, but it does take a few minutes to explain. Now I'm going to go back to my explainer file in Photoshop and I want to explain the perceptual hierarchy. So what does that mean? Basically, I'm trying to explain how humans perceive colors. Now you can see several bars here, and generally what we perceive is that the brighter colors are to your left here. So the brightest ones out of all these colors is yellow and cyan, green, etc., with generally the blue being darkest. However, computers see RGB channels as all equal, but what that results in is something like this. You see that the brightness here, according to a computer, is something like this, which doesn't match with the reality of how human sees the brightness of each of these colors. Now, humans see brightness of each color something like this, right? So yellow being the brightest and all the way to the blue, which is the darkest. To correct for the human sensitivity of light, some really smart people at the International Commission on Illumination came up with an adjustment formula. Let me just walk you through that. So it's in France, so the abbreviation of that organization is CIE, which doesn't really match the International Commission of Illumination because in French it is called this. Now I'm not going to attempt to pronounce the last word, so you can read it here. The short story is that what they've come up with is that to adjust for human sensitivity, they say in the colors that we see, we're going to make 30% red, as in we're going to calibrate the colors that humans see as red 30%, green at 59%, and blue at 11%. Now, the natural question is, well, why is green so high? One theory is because of our ancestors who were living in jungles and forests where the majority of the colors were shades of green. And being able to identify different shades of green was really important to basically for life and death. If you could identify a lighter or darker shade of green, you could potentially pick out whether it's a prey or a predator. So what has this got to do with darker blend modes in Photoshop? Well, if I go back to my Excel spreadsheet here, what it means to find the luminosity of the whole channel is that we need to use those percentages, 30% red, 59% green, and 11% blue. And essentially what we're finding is the luminosity of each pixel, not the per channel luminosity. To do that, for the base layer, we go 30% for the red channel of this, 59% of this value here, and then 11% of this value here, which will give us a luminosity value of 0.52. Now we do exactly the same calculation for the blend layer. So 30% for the red channel, 59% times 0.18, and then 11% times 0.48, which give us a result of 0.24. Once you've got that, then you decide, okay, which one's darker? Now remember, any value closer to 0 is closer to black, which is darker. So in this case, it will choose to show the blend layer. Now let's just verify our understanding by going back to Photoshop. Let's go back to our example bars here, and let's just change the blend mode to darker color. And that you can see that it has automatically chosen the blend layer, which is the purple layer here, which is what we predicted. Now, if I change this to a lighter color, if I change it to, say, 167 and then 146, I'll get this lighter color here. Now this is the conclusion here, because the base layer is 0.52 is lower than the blend layer, which has a luminosity of 0.59, the base layer will show. So let's just verify that and change the color of this blend layer. Let's go to this eyedropper tool, invoke our color picker, and all we've done was included a 1 in front of these RG values. Press enter. Let's make this color a foreground color. And you can see that the base layer, which is the green layer, will go on top of this, which is exactly our conclusion here. The base layer, which is this layer, will show. Now the use case for the darker blend mode is similar to the Darken blend mode, which is that you can use it for burning or shading areas that you want. So that wraps up the walkthrough of the Passthrough blend mode, the normal blend modes, and the Darken blend modes. In the next video in this series, I'll walk you through all the other blend modes, which includes lighten, contrast, inversion, and component blend modes. Now I hope you learned something new out of this. I do put a lot of effort into these explainer videos, at the same time trying to juggle a full-time job, and I'm pretty sure that you won't get this type of content, whether it's free or paid, in the vast majority of tutorials out there, which is in fact one of the main reasons why I made this tutorial, because I just couldn't find any tutorials breaking blend modes down the way that I have. So if you've enjoyed this video or learned something new, it would help me out so much if you can like, subscribe, or share this with a friend. And finally, I know it's a lot to absorb, so don't forget to save this video so you can keep coming back to it and use it as reference material.